Hello and welcome. It could be one of the biggest about-faces in the history of the US military. This week, the Army announced its most radical makeover ever, from a military power designed to crush its enemies into an international nation-building force. Well, 8 years ago, in a presidential debate like those currently being conducted, then-candidate George Bush famously said, "I don't think our troops ought to be used for what's called nation-building." But then the Iraq War happened. A quick and decisive invasion was followed by massive chaos in the streets, a lack of basic services, more and more attacks on US soldiers, and a country that was on the verge of a civil war. All this forced a major reconsideration of what the US Army is supposed to do. The Stability Operations Field Manual took almost a year to put together and represents the lessons learned from the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. It calls for the Army to take a backseat to American soft power initiatives that promote economic, political and social development in, quote, vulnerable corners of the world. But many questions remain, especially can the US Army transition from a fighting force to one that provides aid and public services? And how will the rest of the world accept America's soft power? We welcome your questions and comments anytime during the show. Joining me here in Washington, D.C. is Lieutenant General William Caldwell, the commander of the U.S. Army Combined Arms Center, which produced the manual. He oversees the Army's training and doctrine. Before that, he served as spokesman for the U.S.-led coalition in Iraq. General, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Riz. Glad to be here.
So good to have you. Now, is the U.S. Army still about fighting wars, or has it evolved into that kind of military task force that's really tied up in nation building now, as represented in this latest change?
Yeah. I would tell you we're always going to maintain that core capability of fighting a major combat operation. But what we've recognized is we can never win the peace with military force. It requires the soft power. It requires understanding stability operations and executing that.
You mentioned that. You talk about winning a peace as opposed to winning a war. And how do you define winning a peace?
That's a great question. Winning the peace is a time period when the people are able to be self-governing again, that they have some sort of rule of law, that their basic needs and services are being taken care of. It's at that point where we can withdraw military forces and transition back to their control.
Now, interestingly enough, we had a number of emails when we promoted the show and said you were coming on. If I may put one to you, it came from Shireen in the UAE, in the United Arab Emirates, on the subject of the Army's role. And Shireen wrote in saying, "I think the Army is made of humans like anyone else. They also have families and children. If they really wanted to transition from a fighting force to one that provides aid and public services, this is a better idea for the US Army than the way things are now." Now, that makes me wonder, what's the difference between the US Army and the US Peace Corps?
Well, the one thing that we'll still maintain, like I said, is that capability to fight major conventional combat operations if required. But it's the recognition, it's a cultural shift. This is a very significant manual for the United States Army, and that we are taking on it and embracing the fact that we must be able to conduct stability operations.
It actually leads me to another question that came in by email, if I may, sir, and this came in from California, from Lisa. Here in the USA, who wrote in saying the US Army should not be trusted and cannot be trusted, especially as the people in the military are not trained to build, but to kill. They do not learn the language of the people they attack, and they're presuming they can organize their society. I wonder, really, when someone is skeptical like that, why has it proved to be the case that the US Army was so ill prepared to deal with the cultural sensitivities and issues in Iraq, for example, which really now you're saying that they should be able to handle in this new role?
And that's accurate. We have always had a phenomenal military. We've had a great destructive force that can, in fact, be very, very lethal. But the constructive piece, the part that reaches out and gives the helping hand and assists other people, has always been there. We've always used it at different points in times, but we've never embraced it, made it a part of who we are, and codified it into our doctrine, which drives changes throughout our entire Army.
The difficulty you have, of course, is an army is made of many components. General like yourself and the officers often have a much higher level of education and understanding of the world out there. When it comes to the recruits, the guys who at the bottom end do the on the ground fighting and so on directly, they don't often have the kind of training that's needed. Can they easily adjust to this change where they will be able to take on the softer role?
Well, I tell you what we've done, Riz. I oversee all the education training for the Army. And one of the things we have done is when a young soldier comes into the Army now, he or she are taught from day one about cultural sensitivity, about operating amongst the people.
This is new, is it, sir?
This is. Right. And this is something just in the last two years or so we've really inculcated into the initial entry soldier into the United States Army. but it's a part of who they are now, which is different than 5 years ago, the way we brought them in.
Can troops who have to have that kill power, as you described, that power to maintain a military force, also have this dual role? Can they mentally adapt to this? Many of the stories we hear of troops coming out of Iraq, when they're on the ground, they've experienced the stuff that's been going on. They come back with very mixed emotions, often with a lot of hate for the society they've been exposed to, because they feel they're targeted.
What I would tell you is, when they're able to operate amongst the people, when they're out there among the people day to day, they understand that we're all human, and they're just like us. As that one lady said in her email, they have the same wants and desires just like we do. There's no difference. And then they develop a real feeling for the people. And so the latest thing we've started in the last year and a half of being out there amongst the people is having a real significant difference in how our soldiers look at the Iraqi citizens.
Have you also changed the way you look at the kind of people you recruit? Because of course the difficulty has been getting people into the military nowadays. Are you able to get the quality of recruits you need who can adapt the way you need them to?
We have been, and we've been real fortunate. We're able to meet our recruiting goals. They're all still an all-volunteer force. They want to be there. They want to serve their nation. And so when you get a person, a young man or woman like that, it is much easier to mold them into that military mindset that we want them to have.
Now, when you have the military going in, doing roles that often are seen done by the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations, there's a danger that the lines get blurred, and the country, that is being serviced, if you like, can't recognize the difference. And for the NGOs, this can be quite dangerous. They can be mixed up with the military as well. How do you make sure those lines aren't blurred?
Well, no, and that's a great point. As we've went through this manual, we worked with like Interaction, the United Nations. We've worked with the U.S. Institute for Peace, many of these non-governmental organizations. And the key thing is, we don't want them to lose their uniqueness. We want them to stay separate and distinct from us, because that's what gives them the ability to do what they do so well that we would never be able to do. But what we also recognize is, unless there's inherent security in the area they're operating in, it's very difficult for them to do their job. So we do need to have some sort of cooperation amongst us. No intent at all to direct them or tell them what to do. They will absolutely do exactly what they think they need to do. But if we're cooperating with each other, we can explain what we're doing and where we're doing it, and they can give us any concerns or apprehensions they have about our actions.
Would insurgents be able to tell the difference?
Absolutely, and we have stressed we have really stressed with our soldiers in their training that we are not a non-governmental organization. We are still a military force with the capability to be very lethal if required. However, we understand that when there's nobody else to help get the electricity up, to get the water running, to take care of the sanitation, to help deliver the food, if required for the basic needs of the people, then we'll have military members help do that.
We've got a caller on the line, General. It's Yami in Austria. What would you like to ask, please?
Yeah, I wanted to ask if the expansion of American military abroad affects the economy, and also I saw in the news, these days that the American military, there are people who control, who make important decisions in Washington D.C. and who are manufacturers of arms.
Okay, I'll get onto that point in a minute. I realize what you're talking about, the lobbying power as well. But let's get onto that first issue. Can America afford the military the way it wants to, especially when we look at the current financial situation, sir?
Yeah, no, there's going to be some tough challenges for whoever is elected as our next president. When he comes into office, he will have to look very hard at the utilization of military force abroad and the challenges we're having internally with our own economy right now.
And of course, you have the issue, the second part, I think what Yami was referring to is there are people, obviously, there's strong lobbyists for greater military spending. There's a lot of military hardware purchases and sales tied into this. How are these organizations affected, and how might they react as the military takes on a slightly different role? Does it have an impact on them?
We will still be equipped and trained and able to conduct major combat operations. So we will still have the same lethality of equipment that we have today. That won't change. It's more of a cultural mind shift that our soldiers will need to make.
Well, sir, in this the new field manual, the stability operations one, it states the greatest threats to our national security will come not from emerging ambitious states, but from nations unable or willing or unwilling to meet the basic needs and aspirations of their people. is that basically that where the countries where people are ready to rise up against an outside force such as the U.S.? Is that what you're thinking of?
What we really see that as is over the next 25 years, we have written this manual so that it can help us in the future based on the lessons of the past. And what we see is more failed states occurring, where people's aspirations are not being met, where there's scarce resources and a greater demand, where people are moving from the countryside into the cities and overtaxing the systems there to where they're starting to fail in the infrastructure. And when those situations occur, if in fact we can provide some humanitarian assistance up front, there may never be a need then, and we may be able to help reestablish a government's ability to provide for its people that they need some temporary help with.
Now, would that government have to come to the states, to the U.S. and ask for it?
Yes, that would be the idea, that our Department of State would be called upon to provide some assistance, at which time they would be able to turn to the U.S. military to provide that support to the Department of State to this other nation.
Let's get Mohammed on the line from Kenya, who's been hanging on for us. Mohammed, what would you like to ask? Go ahead, Mohammed.
Yeah, I would like to ask the general that, can it not be seen the intervention of Iraq being failure? And I would like to ask the other question is, and the intervention of Iraq and Somalia, will it not be the same objective? Since also Somalia and Iraq episodes of human rights violations, and more so on vulnerable like women and
Mohammed, I didn't catch
children.
Mohammed, I didn't catch the first part of it. Let's get the general to certainly answer the bit I caught. The comparison between Somalia and Iraq. How do you see the two as different, and why take the action in Iraq that was taken, whereas a lot of people would say Somalia might deserve the same kind of attention?
Yeah, I would say they're very different situations, and I think what's important to see in Iraq is the government of Iraq is in fact taking greater control of the day-to-day operations. The decisions are being made more by the Prime Minister now and his ministers there. The U.S. military has less of an influence today than we did a year ago, and a year from now we'll have even far less. And rightfully so, because the people of Iraq need to be in charge and responsible for their own destiny.
Now, if Somalia is a failing state, as you define it in the new manual, isn't it one that has the right to come to the U.S. and say, help us?
They could, and that's exactly right. And if they were to request some sort of assistance, and the political decision makers made a decision they want to provide some assistance, we in fact would then be prepared and able to do that if that was a policy decision in the United States of America.
Well, General, we have more questions, so we're going to take a very short break here. Stay with us. We'll be back with Lieutenant General William Caldwell in just a moment.